So good evening and welcome to the Monhegan Museum's first ever virtual event. You might have to bear with us a little bit on the technology because we have a little bit more enthusiasm than we do experience with Zoom panel discussions. So my name is Jenn Pye. I'm the director of the Monhegan Museum, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's panel. And they will be discussing one of the most recent additions to the Monhegan Museum collection, which is George Bellows' portrait of Jacki Hudson from 1914. So first, I'd like to share a little bit about the background of the museum and of this artwork. Most of you have probably visited Monhegan, and if you have entered the museum, and if you haven't, I really encourage you to do that. One of the many wonderful and unique things about our museum is that everything in our collection has come to us as a gift. Over 30,000 items and more than 2,000 works of art, and everything has been given. On a few rare occasions, a donor or a group of donors will get together and contribute funds specifically designated for an important purchase of an object or an artwork. And this particular painting is one of such occasions. There we go. So at first glance, this is a charming portrait of an impish young girl, but the stories behind this work, the artist, the subject, and the occasion that it was painted for, make it a really important piece of Monhegan's history. The fellow subject here is Jacki Hudson. She was born in 1910, and she spent every summer of her life on Monhegan until her death in 2001. Jacki was an artist herself, and she attended the Art Students League and the National Academy. And she was active in numerous community organizations, and she was one of the founders of the Monhegan Museum. This is one of Jacki's paintings. So Jacki was the first major donor of artwork to the Monhegan Museum, and her gifts included works by Leon Kroll and Mary Mason, Robert Henry, Randall Davy, and her father, Eric Hudson, and many others. Many of these artists were friends of her father's that would have spent time socializing on the Hudson's porch when Jacki was a child. And among the 36 works that she donated to the Monhegan Museum were George Wesley Bellows' Iron Coast, Monhegan. So this particular painting of Jacki is particularly important to me as an addition to the collection because I had been trying to locate this painting for years, unsuccessfully. And Ed is going to talk more about the history of Jacki, Bellows, and this work. And that brings me back to our panelists, who are Ed Deci. Ed is the president of the Monhegan Historical and Cultural Museum Association. He's been coming to Monhegan since 1973, and he has been leading the museum since 1983. He's curated numerous exhibitions on Monhegan art, both on and off island. And in his mainland life, Ed has been a professor of psychology at the University of Rochester for the last 49 years, and his field is human motivation. We also have Susan Bateson and Stephen Fuller, and they are major supporters of our museum, and Susan serves on the board as vice president and secretary. Steve is a lifelong sailor, and he first anchored in Monhegan Harbor in 1978. Susan joined him in 2008, and the museum and the island's trails became a favorite destination for them, and they began collecting Monhegan art in 2005. And finally, we have Will Coleman, who is an art historian specializing in the history of landscape art. Will is currently the Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Olana Partnership, Frederick Church's 250-acre estate in Hudson, New York. And Will has been coming to Monhegan since he was an infant, and this year he joined the board of the Monhegan Museum. So welcome, Will. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ed Deci.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure who all is there, but I'm excited that there are a lot of people there, a lot of people who have interest in the Monhegan Museum, in this wonderful new additional work of art that we've been given in very recently, and which you'll be hearing a lot more about today. And it's all involves a lot of Jacki Hudson in various ways. First off, it's a picture of her when she was 4 years old. When I say a picture, I mean a painting, of course. And she had spent her whole life on Monhegan. Every summer she was there. She was around, involved in all kinds of activities. She was involved with the museum from the very beginning. And so it's exciting to me to be able to talk to you and to talk about Jacki. I'm going to start actually with talking about her family, and because that really ties very much into this whole thing. Her father's name was Eric Hudson. In 1897, he was a young, prominent artist in Boston and in Cape Ann. One time during that summer, he decided he would go to visit his family who had a house in Mount Desert, and took a couple of his friends who were also artists in Boston along with him. And as they moved on from Boston toward Mount Desert, one of his friends, Frank Myrick, said to him, "Eric, why don't we stop off at Monhegan and just have a little visit?" Eric had never been to Monhegan, so he quite excitedly said, "Well, sure, let's do that." So in his boat, the Minstrel, his sloop, they came into the Monhegan harbor and looked around, and Eric thought it was just incredible. So the next year, in 1898, he went back to Monhegan with his mother. His mother looked around, bought a large piece of land right on the harbor, the Monhegan harbor, and then she got somebody to build him a house. The house, needless to say, well, maybe I should say it. So the house is the one that is still there on Monhegan 100 years later. And it's the house where Jacki and her sister Julie spent all of their summers along with their father and mother. Eric had friends who were artists, some from Boston, as I've already mentioned, but there were some from New York. And the ones from New York were included Robert Henry, who at that point was the greatest teacher of kind of modernist painting in New York City. He came to Monhegan for the first time in 1903, and he was blown away by it. He went back to New York to his classes, where he had students like Edward Hopper, Rockwell Kent, Randall Davy, and on it went. And he said to them, "I have just found this amazing place, and you folks ought to all go there. So in fact, they began to. You know, the first one was Paul Doherty, and then the next one was Rockwell Kent, and then it went, including Edward Hopper and C.K. Chatterton and so on. So one of the interesting things is because Eric knew all these artists. When they came to Monhegan, they looked him up and spent a lot of time hanging out at this house that Eric's mother had built for him. Well, at one point, when Jackie was 3 years old, 4 years old, and there were these various artists that I've just been speaking about, as well as the Boston ones that included S.P. Rolt Trisket and various other of the artists from Boston. They would all be over at the Hudson house in the evening after they'd been painting all day and just be talking art. Jackie would just be crawling around the floor, whether it was out on the porch or in the living room or wherever it was. But from the time that she was 2 or 3 years old, she knew George Bellows and Rockwell Kent and various of these other people. So it's incredible that this painting by Bellows of Jackie really goes back to essentially her very earliest part of her life. So essentially, the house that Eric's mother built was the family's house on Monhegan. They had other houses in other places, but that was their house on Monhegan, and that's the one where Jackie and Julie, her sister, her older sister, that was the one where they would spend every summer when they would be during the winter. Jackie had an apartment in New York and was doing art there. Julie worked as a librarian in Princeton. But every summer they would always come back to this one house, and her father would come there as well, and his friends, the artists, would all be there. In 1914, it was the year of the tercentenary on Monhegan. That was the year, the 300th anniversary of when Captain John Smith first landed on Monhegan and set up the first community of Europeans. And so in 1914, which was the 300th anniversary, it was a big deal for people that were on Monhegan and involved with Monhegan and so forth. And amongst the things that happened that summer, and there were many events that happened, but amongst them was the first formal art exhibition ever held on Monhegan. So many of these artists that we know, Charles Ebert and Wilson Irvine and various of the New York people, including Bellows, of course. They were there on Monhegan that summer, and they got joined in with the exhibition of the art that was in that event, the newest and exciting exhibition. So, Bellows entered the exhibition, of course, like all the other artists who was there. But what Bellows entered were two portraits. One was a portrait of Julie Hudson, and the other was a portrait of Jacki Hudson. The painting that we're talking about today is the one of Jacki Hudson that was in that tercentenary exhibition. As I said, the Julie Hudson portrait was also there. The Julie Hudson painting is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City and has been for decades. So Bellows considered these very important portraits because he had them in that special exhibition on Monhegan. The one ended up in the Metropolitan, and the other one, the one of Jacki, was lost for many years. And what some of the people are going to talk to you about now is how that painting, that incredible painting of Jacki, how it was found and is now part of our museum collection.
Now we're going to move on to Susan Bateson and Stephen Fuller, who are going to talk more about how that painting came to be in the museum collection, as Ed said. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Jen. Good evening, everyone. The story that we're going to share with you started on June 7th, and it ends on July 30th, just this past summer. And the auction was July 1, so that's the climax. The auction took 40 seconds to give you some sense of the buildup here. So we're going to tell you the story and how we got where we were going. We've broken it down into some distinctive parts. The call, due diligence, strategizing, the bid, and next steps. So the story starts with a call.
So as Steve mentioned, Ed called us on June 7th and mentioned that George Bellows' portrait of Jacki Hudson was coming up at auction. And we were familiar with heritage auctions because we purchased a couple of paintings of Monhegan through this auction house, but we had not yet received our new catalog. And Ed mentioned that this work was in there and proceeded to tell us how very important Jacki was to the Monhegan Museum, both as a founder of the museum herself, but also as perhaps one of the most significant donors of major works to our museum. And so we were intrigued and started to think about purchasing this work. And then Jen sent us an email and outlined her reasons for why this was such a significant painting for the island of Monhegan. and told us about her search for the painting for a number of years. And so that for us just sealed the deal, and we were sold and decided that we needed to find a way to buy this painting for the museum. So that we set about, as Steve said, we set about to start our due diligence.
So after we received Ed's call, and I didn't know about this auction, we went online and pulled up the auction catalog. It has just a wonderful, it was a very big auction, and it had just a wonderful display, 2 pages, 1 full-page picture of Jackie, and then quite an extensive provenance and history of George Bellows, and a little bit about Jackie herself, but it said nothing about her role in Monhegan. And as we learned from talking with Ed, I may say, put a little more emphasis on this than actuality, that I think of her as the founder of the museum. There's actually quite a few people that were involved in founding the museum, but she was part of that story. And that really intrigued us. What wasn't in that catalog was a condition report. So the first thing we did is call up Heritage Auctions and asked for a condition report, and they said they would get one. Within 24 hours, we had an email from Aviva Lehman, who is Vice President of American Art for Heritage Auctions, and she sent us a condition report. The condition report said the painting was in quite good shape, needed cleaning perhaps, and maybe a little restoration here and there just from age. And but what this started was an exchange of emails, because I emailed Aviva back and told her what I had learned from Jenn and Ed about the importance of this painting, more so than they knew. They had no idea of this side of the story. And after about 10 emails with Aviva, we started thinking that they wanted us to win this auction, bring this piece back, as we would say, bringing Jackie back to Maine. We also did some research. We of course, had no idea what this was going to sell for. And we certainly don't have an unlimited budget. So I went on Ask Art and looked at all the other auction pieces that Bellows paintings have gone through, and particularly the portraits, and compared the price they sold for with the range that the auction had established that they thought the price would be. And most of those fell within the range, which said, well, the range that Heritage was suggesting was 70 to 100,000.
Yeah.
And some of his were more expensive, a few were less expensive, but the idea is that we sort of felt that, well, the right price for Jackie was going to fall under 100,000 and probably over 70. And but there were some that just blew right on through those limits and made us a little concerned, because we really felt we should bring this back. But in any event, with that as background, we needed to make a plan to how we were going to proceed.
So the first thing that we did was talk to our tax accountant about what was going to be the best way for us to make this gift to the museum. And then we worked with Jenn so that the museum could be the legal purchaser of the painting, and that then Jenn certified that Steve would be the designated bidder on behalf of the museum, with the promise that we would provide the funds for the purchase. And then we had another phone conversation with Ed, and between us determined that, no matter what happened in this auction, we really needed to bring Jackie home. And so Steve and I lined up a couple of other friends of the Monhegan Museum to serve as backup bidders, backup funders of the price, just in case, as Steve said, the potential for the price to blow through the range that we thought was likely. And in fact, I think one of our friends who was a backup bidder is in the audience today. So I'm going to take this opportunity to give a little shout out to John and thank John for his support as we went into this process. And so with all of those ducks in order, well, the other step we took actually was we wanted to be sure that technology didn't abort this process. And so we put in a high bid to the auction house so that if our phone line failed, because this was an auction done entirely by phone, that the auction house knew how high we would be willing to go so that there was no chance we could lose this painting. And so with that, we were set up for the auction day, which was Steve's job.
That's called a secret bid, by the way. We didn't know about that, but auctions are complex events. And while we had participated in person in auctions and done some online on the telephone, today they're all being done visually or virtually, excuse me, in some fashion. They're online, they're on the telephone, they're not in person. So you really don't get a sense of them. Other than they go fast. They tell you they typically are going through at least one bid or one item a minute, sometimes faster, but you don't have time to think. On this particular case, once the price got above $50,000, it was going up at $5,000 an increment. So you're spending money very quickly, and it isn't like you can have a discussion about it. So we set up a command center in our kitchen, on our kitchen island, sort of like we're not sitting there tonight, but with a computer, we have our telephones, we have our landline set up as a backup, but we're on our cell phone. The call from Heritage came in a couple lots before ours. The auction, we were an hour and a half into the auction or so, and we're getting close to our time. And the woman who was representing us, I'll call her our agent, an employee of Heritage, but she was going to do our bidding for us, and. So we had a couple of minutes, perhaps, before we got started to talk with her. And we told her that we really wanted to get this, that we were in this for the keeps, and that she could just run the auction for us until it got to $100,000. And at that point, we needed to stop and start thinking about this, because clearly this could have run away. We don't know who we're bidding against. You have no idea how many people are on the telephone or on the computer. But in any event, we sort of gave her permission to bid for us. Remember, $5,000 a bid. Started at 35. Before we knew it, it was over 50, and it's going up fast. And all of a sudden here, and we're trying to pay attention and hear this, so we know what time we should say yes or no. And we hear $85,000, and I'm getting a little nervous, and I ask, well, who owns it? Whose bid is that? And our agent says, it's yours. Congratulations, you've won this auction. It all took 40 seconds, as I said at the outset, really fast. We're looking at ourselves, almost not thinking that not believing we've done this. And in that short amount of time, when you add the buyer's premium, the 25%, we ended up in 40 seconds spending $106,000 in change. What was interesting in talking to Aviva later, she said, you know, there was another party who really wanted this painting. And luckily for you, we couldn't get them on the phone. We had, for unknown reasons, they didn't answer the phone that day. But as a result, we've just concluded that it was destiny, that Jackie should come back to Monhegan. And certainly enjoyed being part of that journey. So 4 weeks later, Jackie arrived we had it sent to our house and we were going to take it in for restoration. But she arrived here safe and sound, and that was on the 30th of July. So we were very concerned in that absence or that passage of time, that getting it here and making sure everything was up and up.
Well, and as you can see, it's a beautiful painting, so we were thrilled. So from here, it goes for restoration, which will probably take most of the winter. As we said, we think it needs probably a light cleaning and a varnish, perhaps some minor repairs, and the frame could use a little work. But the hope is that Jackie will go on a boat in June, and that she'll be on exhibit at the museum in July. And the two of us are very excited about seeing her on a Monhegan Museum wall. So thank you.
So that's our story.
Yeah, that's our story. It was great fun. Thank you, Jen and Ed, for bringing this to us.
Thank you on behalf of everyone out there listening, 109 participants right now, for your generosity to this special museum, which really does shape lives, as I can attest. I can't wait to see it for myself. It's a riveting story of the drama of this thing. So far we've heard a fair bit about the historical importance of this lovely painting to the Monhegan Museum and why it's such a special occasion that it's come home, and how it fits so well in this great collection. I'd like to talk more about the artistic merit of the picture and the artistic importance of this, the art historical perspective on all this. Monhegan goers, lovers of the Monhegan Museum, have a very particular and individual perspective on this great American artist, George Bellows, whereas for most of the world, Bellows means this sort of thing, these brutal, bloody, charismatic boxing paintings. So I want to start there just to remind us what Bellows was known for, and this is maybe the top of the Wikipedia entry, as it were. Bellows is born in Columbus, Ohio, and he is an athlete himself. In addition to making these images of competition, you see him there in the baseball uniform of Ohio State University, and he was no mere bench warmer for that team. He was an incredibly skilled athlete, an unusual kind of artist who wasn't just stuck in the studio barely getting any sunshine, but really out there competing, and indeed was given an offer to play for the Cincinnati Reds. Really unusual life story, gives it all up, as Ed alluded, to go to the big city and to try to make a go of it in the visual arts. So he's turning down this other really viable career path, but still through his art, staying connected to this masculine realm of physicality and brutal conflict. Boxing in this period is illegal, and you have to be a member of a private club to compete. So this would be Stagg is an outsider of the club who is becoming a member for one night only so that you can engage in this illicit conflict. And there have been some suggestions, I think you can see my cursor here, that this may be a Bellows self-portrait in the foreground. So that's one extreme of Bellows. When he comes to Manhattan, he enters the New York School of Art, which is a really interesting artistic milieu at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's the institution that later becomes the current day Parsons School of Design. So in that setting, he has this choice to make, a choice that leads him down the road toward making the painting that is our focus today. The choice between the great society portrait painter, the fashionable man of letters, the society figure, William Merritt Chase, And there you have a sense of William Merritt Chase's style and also his world. The interior of his famous studio at the 10th Street Studio building a little bit earlier, but nonetheless a sense of his taste, lavishly furnished, making this beautiful environment in which to make paintings and purchase them. So that's one extreme. And on the other extreme, you have this figure who Ed has introduced us to, Robert Henry. And for those in the know, that is how you pronounce that surname. That looks like it should be Henri. Henry indeed. And this is a painting I came to know well at my previous employer, the Newark Museum of Art. A picture of an inhabitant of the modern city in all its complexity, in all its energy, in all its brutality. So maybe that's a through line for Bellows. So he embraces the urban realism of Robert Henry, taking the current lived reality of the modern city rather than this aestheticizing, perfecting vision of the past, the William Merritt Chase school. And he enters into this group that's commonly known as the Eight, or the Ashcan School related groups that are taking as their subject that energetic modern city, often ugly subject matter, embracing the tenement towers. And a crucial context for all this is progressive politics. Unquestionably, part of what draws Bellows to Henry is their concern for the plight of the working poor, the workers in general. And this is just one of many contradictions in Bellows's life. So on the left, you have this masterpiece in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And if we had any doubt about the politics of this picture of a sweltering day in the big city where there's very little space to go around, a teeming mass of humanity, we know that this very painting was reproduced as the cover of an issue of the socialist magazine, The Masses, with the title, "Why don't they just go to the country for vacation?" Said in the voice of an out-of-touch Upper East Sider, no doubt. So he puts a very fine point on it there. He gives a really harsh critique of the out-of-touchness of the elite. And then at the same time, he's making pictures like the one on the right. He is taking as another worthy subject for his brush the pursuits of the leisure classes, tennis at Newport, polo matches, yachting. He is perfectly comfortable navigating between these two worlds. And we can talk about this in the discussion. I see there's some good questions popping up, and please do submit more in that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Is there an edge of critique in this painting? I'm not seeing it, but maybe somebody would argue that there is, that he is still that staunch socialist who's rejecting the temptations of wealth. So this is the contradiction that is permeating his work with Robert Henry, and it's that contradiction that continues in his portrait practice. So I want to underline, even if you know Bellows as the maker of great Monhegan landscapes, these bold pictures of a rough granite coast of Maine, even if you know Bellows as the maker of those charismatic boxing paintings that you might have had a poster of in your dorm room, portraiture and the focus on the figure is a core part of his practice, even when excised from those larger contexts like athletic conflict. So here again is another dichotomy, not unlike that one between the Chase school and the Henry school. Both of these works by Bellows, two great extremes, two really important figure paintings that are very, very different. One of them approaching a modern street urchin, he would have called it, maybe not our preferred term today, a boy on the streets of New York City. We understand from his name that he's an Irish immigrant. Depicting him with his clothing torn, we might wonder if there's been a scuffle, proudly jutting his chin out with his buck teeth there. This is one extreme, and he's fascinated by those urban types, and he makes that his stock in trade, even as he's also making these perfected images like the beautiful one on the right, which is a kind of allegory of sacred and profane love, harking back to the Italian Renaissance and the work of Titian. So he's fluidly moving between these different social circles, these different genres, and that would also be a core part of his work on Monhegan. So hopefully you're already somewhat familiar with the really deep bond that this great American artist had with Monhegan Island. And if you aren't, allow me to share that this is a shocking statistic, but fully 1/2 of his life's work in oil on canvas is Monhegan paintings. And he was there for only 3 summers, and he goes there and he finds it so incredibly compelling and inspiring that there's this burst of creativity that results. And the painting that has been given to this great island institution is a product of that burst of creativity. So this is my favorite. We may all have a favorite. This is a kind of monumental image of, again, masculine toil against the elements. We might think about the famous photograph of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. These bodies balanced and poised in a position of strain, lugging their dory off perhaps Fish Beach into a much stylized version of Monhegan Harbor with a near vertical manana across the harbor. Nonetheless, he's finding subject matter, finding compositions that had not been seen previously in quite the same way, and finding new options for modern art in the process. One of the contexts for this portrait of Jacki Hudson is that he's coming to Monhegan at a moment of great division in the art world, right after the climactic Armory show. Or right around the Armory show, 1 visit before, 2 visits after, where famous works of European modern art were first displayed in this country. Works like Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, shockingly abstract, very different than people had seen before. And Bellows struggles with this. He's not an abstract artist, even though some passages in his pictures verge on abstraction with this sumptuous, thick paint. He is not called in that direction, and he's struggling for an alternate modernism. And I think that's what he finds in Monhegan. He finds another option, new solutions to the problem of being a modern American artist in the age of Duchamp, Matisse, these challenges coming from abroad. He's finding new coloristic solutions. He comes to be in the same period that he's becoming seduced by Monhegan, entranced by a new color theory called the Morata color theory, which suggests other color harmonies than the expected ones that lead to a lot of strange purples and oranges pervading his later work. There's a lot of productive discovery that comes out of this period on Monhegan Island. So it's wonderful to be able to tell that story a little more fully through this gift. So that's a very brief run through a life that could be a much longer story. We are relatively near the end of that life already by this point in the story because it was so cruelly cut short. 1925, the age of just 43, he dies from appendicitis with just having purchased a new home in Woodstock, New York, not too far from where I'm speaking to you today, getting ready to start out in a new chapter perhaps, and we can only wonder what would have resulted. Nonetheless, these 2 paintings, this pendant pair that should be reunited someday, and I'm sure Jenn will be working on that. It would be really exciting to see them in the same room again before long. They are a product of that lifelong concern. When we look at Jacki, we might see some of those startling color choices that are the product of that Morata color theory. We might see that fascination with the human figure that is a constant across Staggett Sharkey's and Patty Flanagan. We see him looking at the people of Monhegan Island, identifying with them, summer people, the lobstermen alike, finding identification and moving fluidly between social classes and different pastimes. So I think this is a really special painting that helps tell the story of his connection to a very special place. And with that, let's open it up to discussion and we'll see what kind of questions we've got here. I see lots of red icons at the bottom of my screen. Any good ones? Let's all unmute ourselves and let's get into a little conversation here.
So Carl Little had a good one that I think Ed could answer for us. Are there any photos of that first tercentenary exhibition and where was it held?
I don't see any pictures. So, I don't know where it was. I just think it was right out on the, around the schoolhouse. I think we sort of redid what it had been 100 years earlier when we did the quadricentennial.
That's right. I remember reading that it was in Bert Poole's studio. and there were 18 artists represented and 32 paintings. And in 2014, for the quadricentennial, we tried to recreate that exhibition by showing the same artists, but we weren't exactly able to get the same works. But that's what got us initially looking for this painting of Jackie.
Yes, it was.
And that actually leads us into another question that several people have asked, which is, where was she all these years?
Well, she was with George Bellows, and then with Bellows's wife through the estate, and then it went into the public and was sold to a family who was quite wealthy and had a foundation in Washington. And
I remember their name actually, Ed. It was Max and Victoria Dreyfus.
Dreyfus, the Dreyfus Foundation, exactly.
And they didn't have children.
But the interesting thing was that the Dreyfuses, gave the painting through their wills to their chauffeur. And it was in the home of the chauffeur of the Dreyfuses for many years.
Almost
and nobody
50 years,
knew where it was. All of the Bellows specialists, nobody had any idea where it was. And it came up just by a coup, completely unexpected. It came up when the people from Heritage went to the home of the chauffeur looking for other things, and just by coincidence, they saw this painting over there and thought, that's a really amazing painting. And so that's how it got into the auction and is making its way to us in Lighthouse Hill.
Great, thank you. And then there's a question here that would be a good one for Will, I think. Joan Brady asked about the Morata color theory.
Yeah, the Morata Technique, it's worth a Google. It's a strange theory that results in some very strange paintings. In my understanding of it, is that it was suggesting some unexpected ways to moderate colors, that instead of adding more white into yellow to make it a paler white, you would mix in a color like green, I think it was. So you would find other often shocking color harmonies, oranges, purples, and greens, that would be a different way of moderating color tone than merely diluting color. That's my very cursory, non-practicing understanding of it. But I first came across this technique in writing about another painting in the Monhegan Museum in some undergraduate research years ago. Edward Redfield, another really important American landscape painter, Pennsylvania Impressionist. He also encounters the Morata technique via Henry on Monhegan Island. So when you see shocking purples, greens, and oranges, think Morata.
Thank you. And let's see, we have some other good ones. Lauren Lewis, who's going to be doing conservation work, asks if Jackie has been exhibited at any time other than the 1914 exhibition on Monhegan.
I think not. It was, Bellows had it in his home, and then his wife had it personally in hers before it went to the Dreyfuses.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question for either Will or Ed, if anybody's heard of it. Kim Strauss, who, if I remember correctly, is connected to Randall Davies' home, is wondering if anybody knows of a challenge by Henry to Bellows and Davy to paint as many paintings as possible during a certain period of time.
Let's see if Ed remembers. I have a slightly different recollection of a Bellows story that I used to make students of mine do, that he did a kind of immediate drawing practice that he learned from Henry, that apparently you would look intently at a subject and then try to reconstruct it without looking at it really quickly. So it wasn't about producing a number of oil on canvas pictures over a short period of time, but about training your eye, training your mind to retain useful information, and then placing a value on the immediacy of the execution once you've really taken that visual information to heart. So it was a fun exercise to make undergraduates practice that same method on a Bellows painting and see what they could retain, and then make a drawing of that painting.
And Thomas Trang asks if Bellows painted Jackie and her sister because they were similar in age to his daughters.
Good suggestion.
And what's the question?
Did Bellows paint Julie and Jackie because they were close in age to Bellows' own daughters?
Oh. Well, Jackie actually was a good friend of Anne, the daughter of Bellows, Anne Booth, Anne Bellows Booth. She and Jackie were friends, and she, the daughter, Anne Bellows Booth, came to Monhegan one summer. I met her there and spent time with her, but she came to the island to visit Jackie.
And Susan Strickler asks, she says the approach to the sitters are quite different in the Julie and Jackie paintings. So are they really pendants?
I see the point there. I think that they were made as a pair, but do they really need to be displayed side by side? I guess they aren't really looking toward each other or anything that we might expect in that concept, by which we usually mean a mated set that are incomplete without the other. So maybe that word is too strong. I think that they do complement each other. I'm looking at them again on my screen, and they're kind of two stylistic choices even. It's really interesting, the variety of techniques that's encapsulated in those two pictures. So to fully answer that question, we'll have to get them back in the same room and see how they look together.
And several people have asked about the painting that's behind you, Susan and Steve.
Well, it is called Cobalt Sea, and it's by Abraham Bogdanov.
Lovely.
And then we
have
have
from Susan and Stephen. We've heard some from the rest of the people. I want to hear more about your path in collecting. What was your first Monhegan picture?
It was a Jay Conaway. And it was all about rocks and water and the merging of the two, as you can see on Monhegan on the east side where the ocean slams against the rocks incessantly. And you know, that a lot of the artists caught that early on. And it took a while even for us to begin to think about the other dimensions of Monhegan. And that's the work that was done there, the fishing. And there's a large number of artists that capture that quite nicely. Bellows, we have another George Bellows that is Blackhead, and it's a powerful piece too. And Bogdanov and Conaway and Bellows and a number of others just did wonderful water seascapes. The people side of the island are really interesting too. And so we've filled in our collection over the years, trying to capture the way of life on Monhegan as it's changed over time. But the environment is just so dominant. And we see that it's just every turn on the island as you walk around it is a potential painting.
I see one that may be directed to me. That's an interesting one from Bettina Norton. You're welcome to pose the question yourself. I wish your art historian would get a question about the contrast of the subject of realism and the touch stroke execution. I think seeing it written, I understand what you're driving at there. It's rather a strange concept to talk about realistic painting when we are talking about paint that's applied so loosely. I guess what I mean by that is the way art historians use the term realism, which is painting that takes reality as its subject, as opposed to abstraction, but dealing in pure form and color. These are realist paintings, even though they are very loose and subjective and free, and there should be no contradiction in the two. When we put Jackie side by side with some of the really challenging works that Bellows was encountering at the Armory show, I think you'll see what I mean. But he is prizing immediacy rather than levels of detail. And that's a persistent theme across Henry's work as well. You aren't staking your artistic merit on the precision of your brush, but rather on the valuable individual subjectivity that you're bringing to the making.
And I see Bettina also asked a little bit earlier. She was asking about what we had in our collection and that she didn't see any Homers, Paul Sample, or Arthur Thompson. Our collection is comprised completely of artists who worked on Monhegan. So.
Alas, no Homer visit to Monhegan, no Thomas Cole visit. I heard there was a near chance that Thomas Cole was going to make it out there and he would have been maybe the first ever. I came across an intriguing bit of evidence there. Frederick Church makes it to Mount Desert Island, but never makes it to Monhegan. So, a focused collecting mission.
Mm-hmm. And what someone, Thomas Trang asks, do you know where Bellows stayed or lived on Monhegan when he painted here, and what years did he paint here?
For Bellows, is that the question?
Yeah, go for it, Ed. Correct, yes.
Bellows was 3 summers on Monhegan, 1911, 1913, and 1914. The first time he came, he was with Robert Henry, and I think Randall Davey was with him also. And they stayed at the old Monhegan house, which burned down, but was basically right next to the Monhegan schoolhouse. And then he stayed in the house that is now Luther and Iris Miller's house, which was from one of the 3 white houses that are kind of behind the school.
So I'm back. Thank you all. Thank you, Susan and Steve and Will and Ed and everyone for participating. This is really exciting, and I hope you're able to come to Monhegan next summer and see Jackie in person. And
I want to say thank you to all of the people who were participating in any way in this event today. And I welcome you all to Monhegan. If you've never been, please come. And if you've come in the past, please come again and again and again. We love having people come to see the museum and the amazing art that we have there.
Good night.
Good night and thank you.
night. Thank you, everyone.